The night ignites. A moment of reckoning. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant smoke, the kind that lingers like a memory you can't shake. In the darkness of a July night in 2022, a faint hum broke the silence. A low, mechanical drone that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the land itself. Somewhere in the vast, flat expanse of southern Ukraine, a single light flickered inside a camouflaged truck, its glow barely piercing the black. Inside, a young soldier named Taras hunched over a control panel, his face lit by the faint green of a HIMARS rocket systems display. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. The depot in Kakhovka, a Russian-held stronghold, was their target. A sprawling warehouse filled with ammunition that fueled the enemy's relentless advance. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the strike could miss, or worse, hit the wrong place. The stakes were etched into Taras's eyes, wide and unblinking, as he whispered to himself, just one chance. The screen blinked coordinates, a grid of numbers that felt cold and impersonal compared to the lives they represented. Taras's finger hovered over the launch button, his breath shallow. Outside, the night was still, save for the faint rustle of wind through the steppe grass. His crew, 3 others, each a shadow in the cramped cabin, waited in silence. There was Mykola, the driver, whose steady hands had guided them through back roads under drone-filled skies. Olena, the navigator, whose sharp eyes caught every detail on the map. And Dmitro, the quiet loader, who hadn't spoken since they left base, but whose presence was a steady anchor. They were a unit, bound not by orders but by trust, each knowing the other's fears without needing to say them aloud. Taras's mind flashed to a moment earlier that day, when the order came down. The commander's voice had been calm but firm. Kakhovka. Tonight, you hit that depot, you cut their supply line. Taras had nodded, but his stomach churned. He wasn't a soldier by choice. None of them were. He was a mechanic from a small village near Lviv, a man who fixed engines, not one who aimed rockets. Yet here he was, in a war he never imagined, about to send fire into the night. The thought of what lay beyond those coordinates, people, homes, lives, gnawed at him. He wasn't naive. He knew the depot was a military target, but the line between soldier and civilian blurred in the fog of war. The hum of the HIMARS grew louder as the system powered up. Taras glanced at Olena, who gave a slight nod, her face pale but resolute. "Coordinates locked," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. Mykola gripped the wheel, ready to move the moment the rockets launched. Dmitro leaned forward, his hands clasped, as if in prayer. The seconds stretched, each one heavy with the weight of their choice. Taras's finger pressed down, and the cabin shook as the rockets roared into the sky, streaks of light vanishing into the dark. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, far in the distance, a faint orange glow bloomed on the horizon, followed by a low rumble that rolled across the steppe like thunder. Taras stared at the glow, his heart pounding. Had they hit the target? Had they changed the course of the fight? Or had they unleashed something they couldn't control? The night offered no answers, only the echo of the explosion and the weight of their decision. As the glow faded, Taras leaned back, his mind racing back to the hours before, when the world was quieter, when the mission was just a plan on a map. The steppe under siege, setting the stage. The night of July 11th, 2022, draped the Kherson region in a restless quiet, the kind that comes before a storm. The vast steppe, stretching endlessly under a sky heavy with stars, seemed to hold its breath. Kakhovka, a small city hugging the banks of the Dnipro River, was a linchpin in the southern theater of the war. Its strategic position made it a hub for supply lines, with the ammunition depot at its heart, serving as a lifeline for Russian forces pushing deeper into Ukrainian territory. The depot, a sprawling complex of warehouses and bunkers, was a fortress of logistics, stocked with shells, rockets, and fuel that kept the front lines alive. For the Ukrainian forces, disrupting it was not just a tactical move, it was a necessity to slow the grinding advance that threatened to choke their defenses. The terrain around Kakhovka was both ally and adversary. The flat, open steppe offered little cover, exposing any movement to the watchful eyes of drones and satellites. Fields of sunflower and wheat, golden under daylight, became ghostly silhouettes at night, swaying in the warm summer breeze. The Dnipro River, wide and sluggish, carved a natural barrier to the north, its bridges heavily guarded and contested. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the faint tang of river water and the acrid scent of distant fires. Summer in Kherson was unforgiving, days scorched under a relentless sun, while nights brought a deceptive calm, pierced by the occasional hum of aircraft or the dull thud of artillery in the distance. The Ukrainian forces, stretched thin across the southern front, operated in small, mobile units like Taras's HIMARS crew. The high-mobility artillery rocket system, a gift from Western allies, was a game-changer, precise, long-range, and capable of striking deep behind enemy lines. But its strength came with risks. Each launch revealed their position, inviting counterstrikes from Russian artillery or drones. The crew had to move fast, strike, and vanish into the night. Their base, a makeshift outpost hidden in a cluster of abandoned farmhouses 30 kilometers west, was a world away from the front lines, but never felt safe. Russian forces, entrenched in Kakhovka since early in the conflict, had fortified the city with layers of defenses, checkpoints, anti-air systems, and patrols that made any approach a gamble. The broader war loomed over this moment like a shadow. By mid-2022, the conflict had settled into a brutal rhythm. In the east, cities like Bakhmut and Severodonetsk were meat grinders, consuming lives and resources. In the south, Kherson's fate hung in the balance, with Ukrainian forces planning a counter-offensive to reclaim lost ground. The world watched, its attention split between diplomatic talks in distant capitals and the raw reality of the battlefield. Sanctions, grain exports, and NATO debates filled the airwaves, but for Taras and his crew, these were distant echoes. Their world was the map on Olena's tablet, the coordinates of a depot, and the ticking clock of their mission. Weather played its own role in the drama. The night was clear, a double-edged sword, perfect for targeting, but also for being seen. A faint mist clung to the lowlands near the river, offering a sliver of concealment, but the open steppe left them exposed. Taras, Mykola, Olena, and Dmytro knew the risks. They had trained for weeks, learning the HIMARS' complex systems under the guidance of foreign instructors. The rocket system was a marvel of precision, but it demanded focus and trust in one another. A single error in coordinates, timing, or navigation could spell disaster, not just for them, but for the units relying on their strike to weaken the enemy's grip. The crew's journey to this moment had been shaped by months of war. Taras, at 27, was the youngest, a mechanic who joined the army when his village began receiving refugees from the east. Mykola, a grizzled truck driver in his 40s, had driven supply routes under fire before being assigned to the HIMARS unit. Olena, 32, was a school teacher turned navigator, her knack for maps making her indispensable. Dmytro, the loader, was a quiet giant, a farmer whose strength hid a deep homesickness for his family in Poltava. Together, they were a microcosm of Ukraine, ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, bound by a shared resolve to protect their homeland. As they prepared for the mission, the weight of the world seemed to press down on them. The depot strike was part of a larger plan, one that could shift the momentum in Kherson. Intelligence reports, passed through crackling radios, described the depot as a powder keg. If hit, it could cripple Russian logistics for weeks. But the enemy was not idle. Drones scoured the skies, and Russian artillery units were known to respond swiftly to any attack. The crew's orders were clear: strike at midnight, when the depot's defenses were at their thinnest, then retreat before the counterstrike came. The plan was simple on paper, but the steppe, the river, and the night had their own plans. Taras sat in the truck's cabin, staring at the horizon where Nova Kakhovka lay. He thought of his mother's last letter, tucked in his pocket, urging him to stay safe. He thought of the stories he'd heard. Villages burned, families displaced. The war was a machine, grinding down everything in its path, and tonight he and his crew were a small cog, turning toward a moment that could change its course. The stars above offered no guidance, only a cold, indifferent light. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the crew moved silently, each lost in their own thoughts, their vehicle a lone speck in the vast, unforgiving steppe. Faces in the dark, who they are. The HIMARS truck sat still in the shadow of a crumbling barn, its engine cooled, its crew waiting for the final signal to move. Inside, the 4 soldiers were more than a unit. They were a fragile constellation of lives, each carrying a past that anchored them to a world beyond the war. Taras, Mykola, Olena, and Dmitro were not born for battle, but the war had found them, reshaping their dreams and fears into something sharper, heavier. In the dim glow of the cabin's instruments, their faces told stories of who they were before the rockets, before the steppe, before the weight of this night in July 2022. Taras the gunner was 27, with the lean build of a man who spent his life under the hood of tractors. Born in a village near Lviv, he grew up fixing engines, his hands stained with grease, his evenings filled with the laughter of his younger sisters. He had dreamed of opening a garage, maybe even moving to the city. But the war changed everything. When refugees began arriving in his village, their eyes hollow with stories of bombed homes, Taras enlisted. He didn't talk about heroism. He talked about duty, about the fields his father had ploughed, the church where his mother prayed. Now, as he sat over the HIMARS controls, his mind flickered to his family's last letter, folded carefully in his pocket. "Come home whole," his mother had written. The words felt like a prayer he wasn't sure he could answer. Taras's fear wasn't death. It was failing those who depended on him, here in the truck or back in the village. Mykola, the driver, was a man carved from the earth itself, his face weathered by 42 years of sun and wind. A truck driver from Cherkasy, he had spent decades hauling grain across Ukraine's heartland, his radio always tuned to folk songs. He was a father of 2, his daughter now in Poland, his son fighting somewhere in Donetsk. Mykola rarely spoke of them, but his wallet held a photo of his children, creased and faded from too many touches. He had joined the army after seeing his neighbors' homes reduced to rubble, his gruff exterior hiding a heart that ached for the life he'd left behind. In the truck, he was the steady hand, the one who kept them moving through mud and chaos. But tonight, as he gripped the wheel, his thoughts drifted to his son, wondering if they'd ever share a beer again. His fear was not the road ahead, but the silence of a future without his family. Olena, the navigator, was 32, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. A schoolteacher from Vinnytsia, she had once taught history to children who dreamed of astronauts and artists. When the war came, she traded chalk for maps, her classroom replaced by the cramped cabin of a HIMARS. Olena's mind was a steel trap, calculating routes and coordinates with a precision that awed her crew. But beneath her calm, she carried a quiet grief. Her brother, a medic, had been killed in Mariupol, and his loss was a wound she buried in work. She wore his old scarf tucked under her tactical vest, a reminder of why she kept going. Olena's hope was simple: to see her students again, to teach them in a world without shelling. As she checked the tablet's map, her fingers steady, she pushed back the fear that tonight's mission might cost her that chance. Dmitro, the loader, was the quiet giant, a 38-year-old farmer from Poltava, whose hands could lift crates as easily as they once lifted his children. His farm, with its rows of potatoes and sunflowers, was a memory he clung to like a lifeline. Dmitro had joined the army when his village was shelled, leaving his wife and 2 daughters in the care of his aging parents. He spoke little, his silence a wall against the pain of separation. But his eyes, deep and thoughtful, betrayed a man who felt everything. In the truck, he was the anchor, loading rockets with a steady rhythm that calmed the others. His fear was not the mission, but the thought of his daughters growing up without him, their faces fading in his memory with each passing day. He carried a small wooden cross, carved by his youngest, and touched it before every launch, a silent vow to return. Together, they were strangers turned family, bound by the war's unforgiving demands. The HIMARS unit was their crucible, forging trust through shared danger. They didn't talk about glory or victory. They talked about home, about the small things: Olena's favorite tea, Mykola's old truck, Taras's sisters, Dmitro's sunflower fields. In the quiet before the mission, they shared a cigarette, the smoke curling into the night like a fleeting promise of peace. Each carried their own burdens: Taras's guilt over the lives his rockets might touch, Mykola's longing for his son, Olena's grief for her brother, Dmitro's ache for his daughters. Yet they also carried hope, fragile but stubborn, that their actions tonight might bring the war one step closer to its end. As they waited in the truck, the silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Taras traced the edge of the control panel, wondering if he was ready for what came next. Mykola hummed a folk tune under his breath, a habit that steadied his nerves. Olena double-checked the coordinates, her lips moving silently as she calculated. Dmitro sat still, his hands clasped around the wooden cross, his eyes fixed on the horizon. They were not heroes in the way stories are told. They were people, flawed and frightened, carrying the weight of a nation's hope. The war had stripped away their old lives, leaving only this moment, this truck, this mission. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, they steeled themselves, not for glory, but for each other, for the homes they fought to protect, and for the fragile dream of a morning without war. Shadows on the steppe, the road to Nova Kakhovka. The night was a living thing, vast and restless, as the HIMARS truck rolled out from the abandoned farmhouse under a sky pricked with stars. It was just past 10 p.m. on July 11th, 2022, and the steppe stretched endlessly around them, a sea of shadows broken only by the faint outlines of sunflower fields and distant hills. The truck's engine growled low, a steady hum that blended with the rustle of grass in the warm summer breeze. Taras sat in the gunner's seat, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of the HIMARS control panel, its green light casting faint shadows across his face. Mykola gripped the wheel, navigating the dirt tracks that snaked through the Kherson region, his focus unbroken, despite the weight of the mission. Olena, beside him, traced their route on a tablet, her finger steady as she marked checkpoints. Dmitro, in the back, checked the rocket crates, his movements methodical, a ritual to keep his mind from wandering to the family he'd left behind. The journey to the launch point, a secluded clearing 15 kilometers from Nova Kakhovka, was a delicate dance with danger. The steppe offered no cover, its flat expanse leaving them exposed to drones and patrols. Russian forces controlled the city and its surroundings, their checkpoints dotting the roads like traps waiting to snap shut. The crew had chosen a route through forgotten farm paths, avoiding main roads where headlights could betray them. Mykola drove with the lights off, relying on night vision goggles and Olena's precise directions. The truck's tires crunched over gravel and mud, each sound amplified in the stillness, a reminder of how alone they were in this vast, unforgiving landscape. The air carried the scent of earth and distant smoke, a faint reminder of the war's reach. Every few kilometers, the crew passed signs of conflict, burned-out vehicles half buried in ditches, a shattered barn with its roof caved in, a lone tree split by artillery. These were ghosts of battles past, silent witnesses to the violence that had swept through Kherson. Yet there were moments of fleeting beauty. The way the moonlight painted the steppe silver, the soft glow of fireflies flickering in the grass, the distant call of a night bird. These fragments of peace felt stolen, fragile, as if the war might snatch them away at any moment. Inside the truck, tension hung like a fog. Taras's hands rested on the control panel, his fingers twitching as he ran through the launch sequence in his mind. He was no stranger to machines, but this one was different, a beast of precision that could reshape the battlefield with a single command. He thought of his village, the fields where he'd played as a boy, and wondered if this strike would bring them closer to safety or pull him further from home. Mykola's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of pursuit. He hummed a folk tune under his breath, a habit that steadied him, though his knuckles were white on the wheel. Olena's voice broke the silence occasionally, calm and measured, calling out turns or warning of obstacles. 2 kilometers to the ridge, she said, her eyes never leaving the tablet. Dmitro, silent as always, shifted in his seat, his hand brushing the wooden cross in his pocket, a tether to his daughter's faces. The crew had trained for this moment, but no drill could capture the weight of it. The HIMARS was their lifeline, a weapon that could strike from afar, but it was also a beacon. Once they launched, the rocket's trails would light up the night, and Russian drones would hunt them. They had to be gone before the counterstrike came, melting back into the steppe like ghosts. The plan was simple: reach the clearing, set up, launch, and retreat. But the steppe was unpredictable. A sudden rain could turn the paths to mud, trapping them. A drone could spot them, calling in artillery, or worse, they could misjudge the target, and the rockets could fall short, hitting something, or someone, they weren't meant to. As they neared the launch point, the truck slowed, crawling over a low rise. Mykola cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the faint chirp of crickets. Olena checked the coordinates one last time, her lips moving silently as she confirmed the depot's location. The target was a cluster of warehouses on the outskirts of Nova Kakhovka, a maze of concrete and steel packed with ammunition. Intelligence had marked it as a critical hub, but it was nestled close to civilian homes, a fact that gnawed at Taras. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the numbers on his screen, but the weight of it lingered, a shadow in his chest. The crew worked quickly, their movements practiced but tinged with urgency. Dmitro climbed out, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he prepared the rocket pods. Olena set up a small antenna to boost their signal, her hand steady despite the cold sweat on her brow. Mikola stayed at the wheel, ready to move at a moment's notice. Taras ran diagnostics, the hum of the HIMARS filling the air as it powered up. Each task was a thread in a fragile tapestry, woven with trust and precision. They didn't speak much. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. A glance, a nod, a hand on a shoulder. That was enough. The clearing was a small pocket of safety, hidden by a low ridge and a cluster of trees. The steppe stretched beyond, dark and endless, with Nova Kakhovka's faint lights glowing on the horizon. The Dnipro River, invisible in the dark, lay just beyond, its presence felt in the damp air. Taras glanced at the sky, searching for the telltale hum of a drone, but there was only silence. For a moment, he let himself imagine a different night, one where he was home, the war a distant memory. But the glow of the control panel pulled him back, its numbers a stark reminder of the task ahead. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the crew settled into their roles, each lost in their own thoughts. Taras thought of his mother's letter, urging him to stay safe. Mikola pictured his son, wondering if he was safe in Donetsk. Olena saw her brother's face, his smile frozen in time. Dmytro clutched the wooden cross, whispering a prayer for his daughters. The steppe watched, indifferent, as they prepared to send fire into the night. The mission was clear, but the cost was not. They were not just launching rockets. They were carrying the hopes of a nation, the weight of countless unseen lives, and the fragile dream of a morning without war. Fire in the night. The strike unfolds. The clearing was a pocket of stillness, carved out of the restless steppe, as the clock ticked past midnight on July 11th, 2022. The HIMARS truck stood ready, its silhouette blending into the dark ridge that shielded it from prying eyes. The air was thick with the scent of damp grass and the faint metallic tang of machinery, warmed by the summer night. Tara sat at the control panel, his fingers hovering over the launch button, the green glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. The coordinates for the Nova Kakhovka ammunition depot were locked in, a grid of numbers that held the weight of a nation's hope. Mikola kept the engine idling, his hand steady on the wheel, ready to bolt the moment the rockets left. Olena, her tablet balanced on her knees, double-checked the data, her voice a low murmur as she confirmed the target. Dmytro, crouched by the rocket pods, gave a final nod, his face unreadable, but his hand steady as he secured the last crate. The silence was a fragile thing, broken only by the hum of the HIMARS and the distant chirp of crickets. Then, a faint buzz pierced the night. A drone, too far to pinpoint, but close enough to tighten Taras's chest. Olena's eyes flicked upward, scanning the sky through the truck's open hatch. "Nothing on thermal," she whispered, but her voice carried an edge. The crew knew the risks. Russian drones patrolled these skies, and a single launch could light up their position like a flare. They had minutes, maybe less, to strike and vanish. Taras's heart pounded, each beat a countdown. He glanced at his crew, their faces shadowed but familiar, each a tether to the world he fought for. "Ready?" Olena said, her voice cutting through the tension. Taras nodded, his finger brushing the launch button. The moment felt eternal, a pause between worlds. He thought of his village, the fields his father ploughed, the laughter of his sisters. He thought of the depot, a fortress of steel and fire that fueled the war's relentless march. The choice was his, but it belonged to them all. "Now," he whispered, and pressed the button. The truck shuddered as the rockets roared to life, their trails slicing through the night like comets. The sound was a thunderclap, shaking the earth, the air, the very bones of the crew. 6 rockets, each a pinpoint of destruction, arced toward Nova Kakhovka, their glow fading into the dark. For a moment, the steppe was silent again, holding its breath. Then, far on the horizon, an orange bloom erupted, followed by a low rumble that rolled across the plains like a storm. Secondary explosions followed, sharp cracks that lit the sky in staccato bursts, painting the night with fire. The depot was hit, but the night wasn't done with them. As the echoes faded, a new sound cut through, a high-pitched whine, closer now. "Drone!" Mikola barked, his voice sharp with urgency. Olena's tablet pinged, a red dot blinking on her screen. The Russian counterstrike was faster than they'd expected. Taras's stomach dropped as he realized their position was compromised. The HIMARS, a marvel of precision, was also a magnet for retaliation. They had to move now. Mikola gunned the engine, the truck lurching forward as it tore through the clearing. The ridge offered some cover, but the open steppe beyond was a death trap. Olena shouted directions, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Left at the ditch, then north. Stay off the main road." The truck bounced over ruts, its tires kicking up clouds of dust that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Dimitro clung to the rocket crates, securing them as the vehicle swayed, his silence a stark contrast to the panic rising in Taras's chest. The drone's whine grew louder, a predator circling above. Taras's mind raced, replaying the launch, the coordinates, the glow on the horizon. Had they hit the depot cleanly? Had they avoided the homes nearby? The thought of civilian lights in the distance haunted him, but there was no time to dwell. A flash lit the sky behind them, followed by a deafening boom. Artillery, striking the ridge they'd just left. The Russians were zeroing in, their response swift and merciless. Mikola swerved, taking the truck into a shallow gully, its sides barely high enough to hide them. "Faster!" Olena urged, her eyes glued to the tablet. A second red dot appeared, another drone, or worse, a jet. The crew's training kicked in, but the steppe offered no mercy. The gully narrowed, forcing Mikola to slow as he navigated a patch of mud. The truck's wheels spun, then caught, lurching forward. Taras gripped the panel, his knuckles white, his mind a storm of fear and focus. He thought of his mother's letter, the words, "Come home whole," burning in his chest. He thought of Olena's brother, lost in Mariupol, and Dimitro's daughters, waiting in Poltava. They were more than a crew. They were each other's reason to keep going. A sudden jolt shook the truck, a near miss from an artillery shell that sent dirt raining down. The blast's heat washed over them, a reminder of how close death was. Mikola cursed under his breath, his folk tune forgotten. Olena's hands shook as she recalculated their route, her voice steady but strained. 3 kilometers to the next cover, a barn, abandoned. We can hide there. Dimitro leaned forward, his hand on Taras's shoulder, a silent reassurance. The gesture grounded Taras, pulling him back from the edge of panic. The drones were relentless, their buzz a constant threat. Olena's tablet showed 2 red dots now, circling like vultures. The crew's only hope was speed and stealth, but the steppe was unforgiving, its open expanses a canvas for their hunters. Mikola pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring as they climbed out of the gully. In the distance, the glow of Nova Kakhovka's fires still burned, a testament to their strike. The depot was crippled, its ammunition reduced to ash. But the cost was this moment. Racing through the night, chased by machines that knew no mercy. As they neared the barn, a new challenge emerged. The path ahead was blocked by a fallen tree, its branches tangled across the track. Mikola slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. The drones were closer now, their whine a piercing scream. Taras's heart raced as he realized they were trapped, exposed. Olena's voice cut through the panic. "We go around, through the field." Mikola hesitated. The field a risky detour, its soft earth a potential trap. But there was no time. He swung the wheel, the truck plunging into the sea of grass, its tires sinking but holding. The barn loomed ahead, a dark shape against the sky. If they could reach it, they could hide, wait out the drones, and slip away. But the steppe was alive with danger, and the night was far from over. Taras clutched the control panel, his mind replaying the launch, the fire, the choice. They had struck a blow. But at what cost? The answer lay in the darkness, in the hum of drones, and in the fragile bond that held them together as they raced toward safety. The weight of choice, a stand in the dark. The barn loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the moonlit steppe, its weathered walls offering a fragile promise of safety. The HIMARS truck barreled through the field, its tires chewing through soft earth, the drone's whine a relentless shadow overhead. It was just past 1 a.m. on July 11th, 2022, and the crew, Taras, Mykola, Olena, and Dmitro, were racing against time, their strike on the Nova Kakhovka depot a success, but their escape far from certain. The glow of the burning depot still lingered on the horizon, a fiery scar in the night. But the Russian drones had found them, their sensors locking onto the truck's heat signature. The air was thick with tension, each second a gamble between survival and obliteration. Mykola's hands gripped the wheel, his eyes narrowed as he navigated the uneven field. The truck swayed, its frame groaning under the strain. Olena's tablet glowed in her lap, the red dots of the drones pulsing closer, their paths erratic but deadly. 2 minutes until they're overhead, she said, her voice taut but steady. Taras, still at the control panel, felt his chest tighten, the memory of the rocket launch replaying in his mind. 6 streaks of fire, a depot in flames, and now this. A chase through the night. Dmitro, in the back, clutched the wooden cross in his pocket, his silence louder than the engine's roar. They were a unit, bound by trust. But the steppe was closing in, and the barn was their only hope. The truck lurched as it hit a rut, the impact jarring Taras's thoughts. The barn was close now, its open doors a dark maw in the night. But as they approached, Olena's tablet pinged again, a third red dot, moving fast. "Artillery spotter," she whispered, her face pale. The Russians weren't just hunting them with drones, they were calling in a barrage. The realization hit like a cold wave. The barn might not be salvation, but a trap. If they stopped, they could be pinned down. If they kept moving, the open steppe would leave them exposed. The choice was theirs, and it had to be made now. Mykola slowed the truck, his eyes flicking to Taras. "We can't stay in the open," he said, his voice rough with urgency. "The barn's our best shot." Olena shook her head, her fingers gripping the tablet. "If they shell it, we're done. We need to keep moving. Find another gully." Dmitro leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "The barn. We hide, we wait. They might pass." Taras felt their eyes on him. The gunner, the one who'd pressed the button that started this. He wasn't their leader, but in this moment, his word carried weight. His mind raced, torn between the safety of cover and the risk of being trapped. The drone's whine grew sharper, a mechanical scream that drowned out the crickets. A flash lit the sky behind them, followed by a bone-rattling boom. An artillery shell too close. Dirt rained down, pattering against the truck's roof. Mykola cursed, his hands tightening on the wheel. Taras's heart pounded, his mother's letter burning in his pocket. Her words, "Come home whole," a plea he feared he couldn't keep. He thought of the depot, the lives tied to those coordinates, the homes nearby. Had they been precise enough? Had they spared the innocent? The questions clawed at him. But there was no time for doubt. The crew needed him, and the night demanded a decision. "We go for the barn," Taras said, his voice steadier than he felt. "But we don't stay long. We hide, let the drones pass, then move." Mykola nodded, swinging the truck toward the barn's open doors. Olena's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue, her fingers already plotting a new route for their escape. Dmytro gave Taras a look, a silent thank you, his hand still on the cross. The truck roared into the barn, its tires skidding on the packed dirt floor. The walls creaked as they came to a stop, the darkness swallowing them. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old hay and rust. The barn was a skeleton of its former self, its roof half collapsed, beams jutting like broken bones. The crew killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. Olena switched off her tablet, the red dots vanishing, but the drone's whine lingered, circling above. They sat motionless, their breaths shallow, listening for the next strike. Taras's mind raced, replaying the launch, the fire, the choice. He felt the weight of it. Not just the depot, but the lives of his crew, the families waiting for them. He glanced at Mykola, whose eyes were fixed on the roof, as if he could see through it to his son in Donetsk. Olena's scarf, her brother's, was tucked tightly under her vest. Dmytro's hand never left his pocket, the cross a lifeline to his daughters. Minutes passed, each one an eternity. The drones circled, their whine fading, then growing loud again. Then, a new sound, a low rumble, like thunder rolling closer, artillery. The first shell hit a kilometer away, the shockwave rattling the barn's walls. Dust fell from the rafters, coating Taras's face. Olena whispered, "They're bracketing us. They know we're close." Mykola's hands twitched, ready to start the engine. Dmytro's eyes met Taras's, a question unspoken. What now? Taras's mind churned. The barn was cover, but it was also a cage. If they stayed, the next shell could bury them. If they moved, the drones would spot them. He thought of his sisters, their laughter, the fields of Lviv. He thought of Olena's brother, Dmytro's daughters, Mykola's son. The war had taken so much, but it hadn't taken them. Not yet. He made his choice. "We draw them away," Taras said, his voice low but firm. "Mykola, you and Olena take the truck. Head north to the gully. Dmytro and I stay. Make noise. Make them think we're still here. We'll catch up on foot." Olena's eyes widened. "Taras, it's our best chance." He cut her off, his tone leaving no room for debate. Mykola hesitated, then nodded, his face grim. Dmytro clapped Taras's shoulder, a silent agreement. The plan was reckless, but it was theirs. Mykola started the engine as Olena grabbed her tablet, plotting the route. Taras and Dmytro slipped out of the truck, crouching in the barn's shadows. They gathered debris, wood, metal scraps, and rigged a small fire, its glow a decoy to draw the drones. As the truck roared out, disappearing into the steppe, Taras lit the fire, the flames crackling in the dark. He and Dmytro ran for the nearby trees, their boots sinking into the earth, the drone's whine closing in. Another shell hit. Closer now, the barn shuddering but holding. Taras's heart raced, but his mind was clear. He had chosen to stay, to give his crew a chance. Dmytro, beside him, whispered, "For my girls." Taras nodded, thinking of his own family. The fire burned behind them, a beacon in the night, drawing the drones away from the truck. The steppe watched, silent, as the two men vanished into the trees, their sacrifice a fragile thread holding their crew together. Ashes on the steppe, the silence after the fire. The steppe exhaled as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a thin grey veil softening the harsh edges of the night. The barn, now a smouldering ruin, stood as a silent monument to the chaos that had unfolded. Its walls were scorched, its roof collapsed under the weight of artillery strikes, and the air carried the acrid bite of charred wood and spent explosives. The glow of Nova Kakhovka's burning depot still lingered faintly in the distance, a fading ember against the paling sky. It was July 12, 2022, and the HIMARS strike had done its work, crippling a vital Russian supply hub. But for Taras, Dmytro, Mykola, and Olena, the cost of that strike hung heavy in the quiet that followed, a stillness that spoke louder than the explosions of the night before. Taras and Dmytro crouched in a copse of trees, their breaths shallow, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. The drones had passed, drawn to the decoy fire they'd lit in the barn, and the artillery had shifted its focus, pounding the wreckage instead of them. They had slipped away, two shadows in the steppes' vast embrace, their boots sinking into the soft earth as they moved toward the rendezvous point, a shallow gully 5 kilometers north. Taras's heart still raced, the adrenaline of their gamble pulsing through him. He clutched his mother's letter in his pocket, its weight a reminder of why he'd stayed behind. Dmytro, beside him, gripped his wooden cross, his eyes scanning the horizon for the truck, for their crew, for a sign they'd made it. The gully was a scar in the landscape, its banks lined with tall grass that swayed in the morning breeze. Mykola and Olena were there, the HIMARS truck hidden under a canopy of branches they'd hastily gathered. The truck was battered, its sides caked with mud, but it was intact. Mykola leaned against the wheel, his face etched with exhaustion, his folk tune silenced by the night's toll. Olena sat on the ground, her tablet dark, her scarf, her brother's, clutched tightly in her hands. When Taras and Dmytro emerged from the grass, relief washed over her face, though it was tempered by the weight of what they'd endured. Mykola clapped Taras on the back, his gruff voice breaking the silence. "Thought we'd lost you." Dmytro only nodded, his silence speaking of the daughters he'd fought to return to. The crew gathered in the gully, their reunion a quiet moment of grace amid the war's relentless grind. They didn't speak of victory. The word felt hollow against the memory of the barn's collapse, the drone's whine, the shells that had come too close. Instead, they shared a cigarette, its smoke curling into the dawn like a prayer for the living. Taras looked at his crew, their faces worn but unbroken, and felt a surge of gratitude. They had survived, but the steppe bore the scars of their choice, a burned barn, a shattered depot, and the unseen lives touched by their actions. The strike on Nova Kakhovka had shifted the battlefield. Intelligence would later confirm that the depot's destruction disrupted Russian logistics for weeks, slowing their advance in Kherson and giving Ukrainian forces a chance to regroup. But in the gully, the crew didn't measure their success in maps or reports. They measured it in the breath they still drew, in the hands that gripped each other's shoulders, in the fragile hope that their sacrifice had mattered. The depot's fires had burned out, leaving only smoke and silence, but the war rolled on. Its hunger unquenched, Taras sat against the truck's tire, his eyes tracing the horizon where Nova Kakhovka lay. The city was a distant smudge, its homes and streets invisible but heavy in his mind. He thought of the coordinates he'd entered, the rockets he'd launched, and the lives caught in their path. The depot was a military target, but war was never clean. Had a stray rocket hit too close to a home? Had a family woken to fire instead of dawn? The questions gnawed at him, unanswered in the steppe's vast quiet. He pulled his mother's letter from his pocket, its edges worn from his touch, and read her words again. "Come home whole." He wanted to, more than anything, but the war had carved pieces from him he wasn't sure he'd find again. Olena, nearby, tucked her scarf into her vest, her fingers lingering on the fabric. She thought of her brother, his laughter, his sacrifice in Mariupol. The depot's destruction was a step toward justice, but it didn't fill the hole he'd left. She looked at Taras, saw the weight in his eyes, and offered a small nod, a shared understanding of the cost they carried. Mykola, lighting another cigarette, thought of his son in Donetsk, wondering if this strike had brought him a safer day. Dmytro, silent as ever, knelt by the gully's edge, his cross in his hand, his lips moving in a prayer for his daughters. The steppe stretched around them, its grasses whispering secrets it would never share. The morning was cold, the air heavy with dew. The crew knew they couldn't stay long. The Russians would be searching, their drones scouring the steppe for the HIMARS that had struck their heart. Mykola checked the truck's engine, his hands moving with the ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime fixing things. Olena plotted their route back to base, her tablet glowing faintly in the dawn. Taras and Dmytro gathered their gear, their movements slow but deliberate, each action a defiance of the night's terror. They were tired, their bodies aching, their minds heavy with the choices they'd made. But they were alive, and that was enough for now. As they prepared to move, a lone bird called from the grass, its song sharp and fleeting. Taras paused, listening, the sound a reminder of a world that still existed beyond the war. The steppe was silent now, its fires quenched, its dangers hidden in the light of day. But the silence was not peace. It was a pause, a moment to breathe before the war called them back. The crew climbed into the truck, their faces set, their bond unbroken. They had struck a blow, paid a price, and carried on. The depot was gone, but the steppe remained, vast and indifferent, holding their story in its endless embrace. A letter unsent. Echoes of the steppe. The truck rumbled north through the steppe, its tires carving faint tracks in the dew-soaked earth as the dawn of July 12th, 20 spread a pale gold across the horizon. The HIMARS crew, Taras, Mykola, Olena, and Dmytro, sat in silence, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a night that had tested their souls. The strike on the Kakhovka depot had left its mark, not just on the battlefield, but on their hearts. The war was far from over, but this moment, this quiet drive back to base, was a fragile reprieve, a chance to carry their thoughts home, even if their bodies were still bound to the front. The steppe stretched around them, vast and timeless, its grasses whispering stories of those who had passed through, soldiers, farmers, dreamers, all caught in the war's unyielding grip. Taras leaned against the truck's window, his eyes tracing the endless fields. In his pocket, his mother's letter rested, its words a tether to a life he barely remembered. He pulled it out, unfolding the worn paper, and began to write in his mind. A letter he might never send, but needed to form. Dear Mama, he thought, we did something tonight. We struck a place that fed the war. And maybe, just maybe, it'll bring us closer to peace. He paused, his gaze catching on a lone sunflower, its head bowed as if in mourning. But it's heavy, Mama. Every choice feels like a stone I carry. I want to come home whole, like you asked, but I don't know if I can. The words stayed in his head, too raw to write. But they were his truth, a confession to the steppe and the sky. Mykola drove with one hand, the other resting on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the dirt path ahead. The folk tune he loved was silent now, replaced by the memory of his son, fighting somewhere in Donetsk. He thought of the depot's flames, the way they'd lit the night, and wondered if his son had seen a similar sky. Mykola's hope was simple: to sit with his children again, to share a meal, to hear their laughter. The strike had bought time, disrupted the enemy's plans, but it hadn't brought his son closer. He glanced at the crew, their tired faces a mirror of his own, and felt a quiet pride. They weren't heroes in the way stories are told. They were people, bound by a shared fight, carrying each other through the dark. Olena sat beside Mikola, her tablet dark, her scarf, her brother's, tucked tightly under her vest. The depot's destruction was a victory, but it didn't erase the loss that drove her. She thought of her brother, his smile, his courage in Mariupol, and how she carried his memory into every mission. The steppe rolled past, its beauty a stark contrast to the war's scars, and Olena let herself imagine a classroom again, her students' faces bright with curiosity. She wanted to teach them history, not as a record of battles, but as a story of people who kept going, who found light in the dark. The strike was a step toward that future, but it was only a step, and the road ahead was long. Mitro, in the back, held his wooden cross, its edges worn smooth by his touch. His daughters' faces were vivid in his mind, their laughter a melody he clung to. The night's danger, the drones, the shells, the fire in the barn, had brought him closer to losing them, but he'd stayed, for them, for his crew. The depot's fall meant something, a chance for his girls to grow up in a world less torn. He looked at Taras, saw the weight in his eyes, and felt a bond deeper than words. They had chosen to stay, to draw the drones away, and that choice had saved their crew. Dmytro didn't pray for victory. He prayed for home, for the fields of Poltava, for the day he could hold his daughters again. The truck reached the base as the sun climbed higher, its light revealing the world's rough edges, burned fields, shattered fences, the distant smoke of other battles. The crew stepped out, their boots heavy on the ground, their faces lit by the morning's glow. They didn't speak of the strike's success or the war's next move. They spoke of small things, a cup of tea, a warm bed, a letter waiting to be written. The base was a cluster of tents and vehicles, a temporary home for those who fought, and as they entered, they were greeted with nods, not cheers. The war didn't pause for celebration. It only offered moments like this, fleeting and precious. Taras sat alone later, under a tree whose branches sagged with the weight of summer. He pulled out a notebook, not his mother's letter, and began to write. To whoever reads this, he started, know that we fought not for glory, but for each other. For the homes we left, the families we love, the land that holds our roots. He wrote of the steppe, its beauty and its cruelty, of the fire that lit the night, of the silence that followed. He wrote of Mikola's steady hands, Olena's sharp mind, Dmytro's quiet strength. He wrote of the choice to stay behind, to light a fire and run, to give their crew a chance. The words were his offering, a way to make sense of the war's chaos, to hold on to the humanity it tried to strip away. The crew would fight again, carry on through other nights, other missions. The depot's destruction had shifted the war's tide, but it was one wave in a relentless sea. Taras didn't know if peace would come, if he'd see his village again, if his crew would stay whole. But he knew they had this moment, this bond, this shared breath in the dawn. The steppe had seen their courage, their fear, their hope, and it would carry their story long after they were gone. For you, reading this, think of the people behind the fire, the ones who carry the weight of choices no one should make. Think of the soldier who writes to his mother, the father who hums a tune for his son, the sister who wears her brother's scarf, the man who prays for his daughters. War is not just maps and machines. It is hearts beating in the dark, hands reaching for one another, dreams that refuse to die. What would you carry into the night? What would you fight for? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Ukraine Frontline War Stories for more untold tales of courage, loss, and hope.